The story of Irish parliamentary independence does not begin in Ireland, but actually thousands of miles away in America with the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1775. Because the demands of the American colonists for no taxation without representation resonated in Ireland. Because although Ireland did have representation, it did have its own parliament. It was a parliament that had been downgraded and had pretty much become an institution with no power in the 18th century. You had the passing of Poynings Law in the 15th century, a Declaratory Act in the early 18th century, and what that meant was that the Irish Parliament really could not legislate for itself. So although there were 300 members who would meet every year in Dublin, they really could only pass legislation that had been decided for it by England, by the British government. And so they felt humiliated. They felt that this was really not a national parliament. They were not representing the Irish people. And the example of the American Revolution was crucially important. Also, because in 1778, France entered the war on the side of the American colonists. And suddenly then, Britain began moving their troops out of Ireland to Britain to protect Britain in the event of invasion. And that really offended a lot of the Irish patriots. People like Henry Grattan, who said, "What is Ireland? It is just a barracks where the British will garrison their troops in times of peace and then take them out in times of war." And that became a major grievance. Also, because it looked like France, well, they might not invade Britain, but they might invade Ireland, and Ireland would not be well defended. And so what's set up in Ireland in the late 1770s, in 1778 and 1779, were volunteer corps in every part of Ireland, groups of people, of citizens, who decided that they would act as a military uniform, as a military unit. They had red military uniforms. It was said that scarlet fever swept the country as people wanted to join these units, including a number of politicians, including Henry Grattan, who became the colonel of the Dublin Independence, one of the Dublin Volunteer Corps. And he gave a major speech in 1779 in which he said that we have become a nation. We acquire a national character. And these volunteer units helped put the gun into Irish politics because they acted as a kind of paramilitary force. They were going around demanding rights for the Irish Parliament, for the Irish people. And Britain was pretty powerless to resist. In 1779, they carried banners around Dublin demanding free trade or else. And Henry Grattan went before the Irish Parliament to pass a motion calling on free trade and pretty much giving an ultimatum to the British to either agree to this or send in the army and crush them. And the government had no choice. And the fact that now the British government was under so much pressure created a momentum for change. And when General Charles Cornwallis was defeated at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 by George Washington, bringing about the collapse of the British government, bringing about dramatic change in Britain, well, that was the springboard then for dramatic change in Ireland, because the Irish patriots jumped at the uncertainty caused by the collapse of the British government, the defeat of the British over in America, to press for further rights. And in late 1781, 1782, you see the repealing of all of the legislation that had been such a grievance for over 100 years. You see a repealing of Poynings Law. You see in 1782 in April, they bring forward a motion to declare that it is the birthright of the Irish people to legislate for themselves, declaring that the Irish Parliament should be a sovereign and independent parliament, connected to Britain certainly, but that it should recognise that this has rights of its own. And they needed someone who would make a great declaration of Irish parliamentary independence in the Parliament. They needed to find an orator who was up to that task. And the person that they went to was the person who I'll talk to you about now, a man called Henry Grattan. And Henry Grattan was considered the great Irish orator of the 18th century. You had Edmund Burke in the British Parliament, and then you had Henry Grattan in the Irish Parliament. And Grattan is really seen as the father of the constitutional nationalist tradition, and his name would be invoked over the next number of centuries, even during the treaty debates that we'll be talking about later on in this course. Grattan was born in Dublin in 1746. He was educated at Trinity. His nickname in Trinity was the Elastic Body because he was full of energy. He seemed to walk around college on his tippy toes. And in a way, as an orator, he was the exact same. He gesticulated wildly. He was full of energy. He was full of passion. And he went to London after his degree to study to become a lawyer. And it's funny, even though he was a great orator, he was not a great lawyer. Because there was a difference between being a lawyer and being a debater, or difference between being someone who could prepare a great speech. And Grattan was someone who loved spending months, weeks preparing his speeches, learning them off by heart, and then delivering them with a passion in the House of Commons. But to be a good lawyer, you need to be able to think on your feet. You needed to be able to respond to what other people were saying. And he wasn't good on his feet. He also wasn't good on detail. And that was to be a bit of a weakness as a politician. But it didn't affect him as an orator when he could prepare a great set-piece speech. So he returned to Ireland, having failed as a lawyer, became a politician, an MP, member of the Irish Parliament in 1775. A lot of the Irish seats, as we've talked about, weren't open at the time. You could buy a seat, and his friend Lord Charlemont gave him a seat in 1775. And over the next number of years, he established himself as this great parliamentarian. And he was a volunteer colonel. He loved going into Parliament wearing his red volunteer uniform. And he was the person chosen to give this great speech on the 16th of April, 1782. And he had prepared it carefully. And he stood up and he said, "Spirit of Swift, Spirit of Molyneux, your genius has prevailed. Ireland is now a nation. And in that spirit I greet her and I say, Esto Perpetua." And in that way, he was drawing a line between himself and the other great patriots of Irish history, Jonathan Swift, William Molyneux. Well, except that that probably wasn't what Henry Grattan actually said, because Grattan was famous for rewriting his speeches afterwards. And if he didn't like something that he had said, he would go and rewrite it. And the first time that the Spirit of Swift lines appear in print was actually in 1811. So after the Act of Union, which had abolished the Irish Parliament in 1800. And really what you see is that Grattan was acting to rewrite the historical record, kind of trying to say, this is what I would have said in 1782 if I had known what was going to happen. We do know what he said on 16th of April 1782 from the parliamentary records, from the newspaper accounts, and it was a brilliant speech. And we know it was a brilliant speech because the House of Commons was so impressed they decided to award him some great honour. And they thought, what will we do? And some said we should build a statue in honour of Henry Grattan. But others said no, statues are for the dead. So instead Parliament awarded him £50,000, an incredible sum of money in today's money. Maybe it might be, close to £1 million. And that was the award that they gave him, which allowed him to buy a house. It allowed him in some of the scandal magazines at the time. They linked him with various young women because they thought now he could get married and he could now start a new life. And he saw this as a great gift from the Irish nation. And he was so exhausted from his brilliant 3-hour oration that he actually went home, went to bed, and stayed in bed for 3 days to recover from his exertions. But in the aftermath of that then, people began to say, well, maybe we need to go further. And Grattan's great friend, who ended up becoming his great rival, was a man called Henry Flood. And Henry Flood said we should get Britain to renounce its Declaratory Act of 1720, declaring the right to legislate for Ireland. We should make sure that Britain can never, ever legislate for Ireland. And Grattan disagreed with him and said, this is unnecessary. But Flood convinced a lot of people, and people began to question Grattan. They began to say that, well, £50,000 is a lot to pay for someone who's botched the job. There was a poem at the time which went, they say he's an honest man, how that word resounds. What made him honest? £50,000. And people began to think, well, maybe Grattan's not such a good leader after all. And Grattan actually offered his resignation as the leader of the volunteer corps, but it wasn't accepted. And so Henry Flood became the key man, and he then forced Britain, which was again still unstable after the defeat to America, and they passed a Renunciation Act. Now, in a way, Grattan was right, because although Britain could pass an act renouncing the right to ever legislate for Ireland, it could also at any future point renounce that act and go back to legislating. And effectively, that's what happened in 1800 with the Union. And Grattan and Flood had furious fights in the Irish House of Commons. Grattan accused Flood of being a great egotist. Flood accused Grattan of just being furious that he wanted all the popularity for himself. And it became so poisonous, so venomous, that they decided to fight a duel. And they decided they would meet in Ballsbridge, just outside of the city centre, to fight a duel. Because duels were very popular in Ireland in the late 18th century and even into the 19th century. It was seen as part of a young man's education that they would fight a duel. And politicians very often fought duels. But Henry Flood was arrested on the way to the duel, and the duel was cancelled. So legislative of independence was won in 1782, and it would last up until 1800 with the winning, with the abolition of the Irish Parliament with the Act of Union. But if I was to ask you what was legislative independence, or if you were to ask me, it'd be very hard to come out with an easy answer, because it wasn't full independence. It wasn't even the kind of Home Rule Parliament that Charles Stewart Parnell would try to fight for at the end of the 19th century. Really, it wasn't very clear what it meant. Britain wasn't very sure. In Ireland, they weren't very sure. For example, all throughout the 1780s and 90s, there were debates about, did this mean that Ireland had its own foreign policy? If Britain went to war, did Ireland automatically go to war, or could it pursue its own independent course? Who controlled economic policy? And could Ireland sign its own economic treaties with countries in Europe and around the world? And none of that was resolved. And those ambiguities caused the British government a lot of concern in the years ahead. But in a way, Grattan really didn't care about those details. This was a symbolic victory. This was a moment when you could say Ireland was now a nation. And certainly that's the way that this period was seen for the next, well, centuries. This period became known as Grattan's Parliament. That's the way it's referred to in a lot of the history books, even though Grattan himself was a kind of an opposition figure for almost that entire period. And he couldn't get a lot of the legislation through that he actually wanted to get through. For Daniel O'Connell in the 19th century, this was, in his words, the only period of Irish history. He adored Henry Grattan. He adored this period. His dream was to restore that parliament and have this back in force. Charles Stewart Parnell gloried in the memory of Grattan's Parliament. You see then the rise of the Irish Volunteers in the 1910s and the Volunteers fighting in the 1916 Rising, again harking back to this period of Irish history, the Volunteers and all of that. But the reality is that it actually wasn't such a great period for Ireland. For Grattan, it was Ireland becoming a nation. For O'Connell, this was a great period of peace and prosperity. The Irish economy soared. This was a time when Ireland was rich and powerful. This was a time when Ireland had secured great things for itself. The reality is actually very different. It actually wasn't a very prosperous time. The Irish state was pretty much bankrupt by 1800. It also was a time when, if you look at who was sitting in that Irish Parliament, they were all Protestants. Catholics did not have the right to vote. Catholics did not have the right to sit in Parliament. And even though, as we'll see, Catholics did get the right to vote in 1793, that was because of what the British government wanted and not because of what the Irish MPs themselves wanted. The Irish parliamentarians saw this as an Irish Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. They saw it as one of the great strengths of this Parliament. One of the key reasons they wanted all of these rights in 1782 was to keep the Catholics out, to stop the Catholics from getting all of these rights, all of these privileges. And Grattan was to fight against that over the next 18 years, but was to fight against it unsuccessfully. And as we'll see in 1797, he actually withdrew from this Parliament in disgust at how repressive it was, at how anti-Catholic it was. And so one of the great ironies of Irish history is that the Parliament which bears his name, the Parliament that in the history books is known as Grattan's Parliament, was one that he himself, by 1797, considered a failure.